We picture King Arthur in shining steel, a crown, a stone castle, knights around a perfect circle of honor. Then the picture hits the timeline, and the armor belongs to the wrong world. If there was a historical Arthur behind the legend, he wore no plate armor and ruled no polished medieval court. He belongs, if anywhere, to the 5th or 6th century, after Roman authority in Britain had broken apart, not Camelot waiting for its walls, fading roads, abandoned Roman stone, exposed borders, communities trying to survive after the old imperial order failed. The first shock is simpler than whether Arthur was real. The Arthur most people know is dressed for the wrong century. A man remembered from post-Roman collapse would have lived under different weapons, different politics, and different fears. His world would not have been organized around chivalric courtesy. It would have been organized around defense, loyalty, hunger, raids, and force. This is not a fantasy retelling, and not a clean debunk. The evidence cannot hand us one certain man, one certain throne, and one perfect biography. It can peel away the later layers, one at a time. First, the court, then the king, then the battles, then the ending. Beneath each layer, the gold gives way to something darker. The marble floor becomes wet earth. The castle wall becomes a ruined Roman arch. The golden king becomes a question. The first object to test is the one that seems most impossible to remove, the round table. The round table feels ancient because it sits at the center of the story. Every knight has a place. No one sits above the rest. The shape seems to explain Arthur, a king powerful enough to rule, wise enough to make dangerous men feel equal. Then a manuscript places a date beside the circle. The first known mention of Arthur's round table comes from Wace, the Anglo-Norman poet who wrote the Roman De Brute in 1155. Not around the year 500, not in the broken decades after Roman power failed in Britain. 1155. Roughly 6 centuries stand between that literary table and the period where a possible historical Arthur would belong. 6 centuries is enough time for memory to harden into symbol, for politics to become romance, and for a military past to be reshaped into perfect kingship. The Round Table cannot serve as early evidence for Arthur's age. It is literary architecture, a later way of giving the Arthurian court a moral design. That does not make it empty. The symbol answers a real courtly fear, proud warriors fighting over honor, rank, and proximity to power. A round table solves that problem beautifully. No head, no favored side, no insult built into the furniture. A beautiful symbol, though, is not a 5th century artifact. The same caution applies to Camelot as most people imagine it. Polished halls, ceremonial courtesy, noble quests, and a court arranged like a dream of order. That world belongs to medieval romance, not to the earliest historical search. The first famous object cannot carry the weight placed on it. The Round Table sits at the center of Arthur's legend, yet arrives too late to stand at the foundation of Arthur's history. With that shining circle removed, the investigation moves backward to older pages, closer to the wars themselves, to ask whether Arthur's name becomes stronger there or more fragile. The older pages do not restore the familiar king. They push him further into uncertainty. The crucial source is Gildas, a British monk writing around the middle of the 6th century in De Exidio et Conquestu Britanniae. He is not writing an Arthurian romance. He is writing a fierce moral account of Britain's ruin, its wars, and its failures. That proximity is why he matters. Gildas is close enough to the crisis that his account cannot be ignored. He discusses the struggle against the Saxons. He knows of Mount Badon, the great British victory that later tradition would pull toward Arthur's fame. Where a later reader expects the name Arthur, the page stays silent. No king, no commander, no savior of Britain. That silence does not prove Arthur never existed. Records from this century are thin, damaged, local, and often written for purposes other than biography. But it creates a serious problem for the simplest legend. The early account has the famous war, but not the famous man. Arthur's name appears only as the sources move farther from the crisis. Around 828, in the Historia Britonum associated with Nennius, Arthur is finally named in connection with war. Yet even there, the title is not the one the legend teaches us to expect. He is not presented in the key passage as Rex. a king. He is called Dux Bellorum, leader of battles. That title lowers the scale of the story. A king suggests a court, a crown, and settled order. A leader of battles suggests emergency. Nennius also gives Arthur a list of 12 battles, but that list is not a verified campaign route we can pin confidently across Britain. It is a later martial tradition, memorable, important, and uncertain. Early testimony does not confirm a shining monarch. It gives silence, delay, and then a military title. The question is no longer where Camelot stood. It is what kind of Britain would need a leader of battles more than a ceremonial king. The trail leaves the throne room and enters the landscape. After Roman power weakened and withdrew, Britain did not become one neat kingdom waiting for a crown. Roads remained. Ruins remained. Roman habits remained. But the machinery that had protected, paid, and administered the island no longer held the same way. Power gathered in harder places, around fortified hills, around coastal strongholds, around men who could command armed followers, hold territory, bargain with allies, and keep frightened communities alive. In that fractured world, Dux Bellorum starts to make sense. Not a monarch presiding over a finished realm, but a battle leader moving through a fractured landscape, where legitimacy could come from victory as much as bloodline. Archaeology cannot give us Arthur's face. It can show the ground where a memory like Arthur's could take root. At Cadbury Castle in Somerset, long drawn into Arthurian imagination, excavations point to major post-Roman refortification. Defensive rebuilding suggests a powerful centre in the right broad period. But Cadbury is not Camelot proven in soil. It gives context, not a name. Tintagel in Cornwall carries the same warning. Later legend tied it to Arthur's birth. That birth story belongs to later literature. What the site does show is high-status activity in the 5th and 6th centuries, with signs of elite life, trade, and prestige. Together, these places shift the investigation away from stone castles and toward timber defences, hill-fort earthworks, elite households, and military networks left behind after empire. This is the strongest historical Arthur we can responsibly build. Not a confirmed king of Camelot, but a debated post-Roman commander, or a composite memory of commanders, shaped by local power, defensive landscapes, and inherited Roman military habits. Later centuries gave him a crown because they wanted order. The evidence gives us something harder, a leader shaped by collapse. Once Arthur is moved out of the throne room and into that landscape, the question becomes physical. What did victory actually look like there? Victory here would not look like a knight riding out for a clean duel. It would have begun close enough to hear shields strike shields, a line of men behind shields, spears angled forward, feet sliding in mud, no space for elegance, and little room for individual glory. One man's courage mattered less than whether the line held when bodies pressed into bodies and fear moved faster than command. This is the battlefield beneath later chivalry, pressure, exhaustion, and the slow breaking of formation. Nennius gives Arthur 12 battles, but those names cannot be treated as a verified campaign map. They come from a later source, and many locations remain debated or impossible to fix with confidence. Used carefully, the list tells us less about where Arthur certainly marched than about how he was remembered, as a figure defined by repeated war. One name presses harder on the record than the rest: Mount Badon. Gildas knew of a major British victory there. Later tradition pulled Arthur toward it, but Badon's location remains uncertain, and Arthur's role in it is not named in the earliest account. Badon remains a pressure point in the record, not a solved battlefield with a crowned king at its centre. A remembered victory, a pause in disaster, and a place where later generations wanted a hero to stand. If an Arthur-like commander belongs in this landscape, his success was not the creation of a gentle golden age. It was survival through force, holding fortified ground, answering raids, keeping alliances from splintering, and winning enough hard fights that memory could later call the result peace. We do not have evidence to pin specific atrocities on Arthur as a person. We do not need invented crimes to darken the picture. The normal machinery of war in a collapsing frontier was harsh enough. Romance turned battle into honor. The older world is less comfortable. Communities enduring because someone, or several people, could organize violence better than the forces closing in around them. That is the ground beneath the crown. After the fighting, later centuries would begin the final transformation, turning violent survival into the king they needed to remember. Later tradition gives Arthur an ending, not a clear one, not an eyewitness account, a sparse, dark mark in the record. In the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals, Camlan appears as a catastrophe involving Arthur and Medrawd. The entry is later and sparse. It does not give us the full drama of a treacherous son, a doomed nephew, a ruined court, and a final moral reckoning. It gives us names, a battle, and loss. The sparseness matters. Medrawd becomes Mordred in later tradition, and the story around him sharpens with time. Betrayal enters, family tragedy enters. The fall of a kingdom becomes personal, intimate, almost theatrical. Those details made the legend unforgettable, but they are not secure contemporary evidence for the 6th century. This is the pattern of Arthur's tradition. The farther it moves from the possible battlefield, the more complete the king becomes. Gildas gives the war and Badon, but no Arthur. Nennius gives Arthur, but as a leader of battles, not the crowned monarch of romance. Geoffrey of Monmouth expands him into a great king with a vast story. Wace gives the Round Table its first known appearance. Malory and later romance gather the pieces into the Camelot most people recognize: knights, quests, courtly love, betrayal, and a shining order already destined to fall. The king grows clearer as the ground beneath him grows thinner. By the end, the evidence divides. The Round Table falls as early history. Chivalric Camelot falls as evidence for the 5th or 6th century. The polished king in plate armor falls out of the world where a historical Arthur would have lived. What still holds? A broken post-Roman Britain, a memory of wars against Saxon power. Fortified hills, fading Roman habits, local commanders, and a tradition that remembered Arthur above all as a figure of battle. What remains uncertain is the hardest part, whether one man named Arthur stood at the center of it all, or whether later memory gathered several violent careers into one necessary name. That does not make the legend worthless. It makes it human. People living after collapse do not only record what happened, they reshape what they need to survive remembering. A muddy commander becomes a golden king because the world that produced him was too fractured, too frightening, and too full of loss to leave untransformed. Camelot is not the beginning of the story. It is the monument built afterward. Under it, there is no round table waiting in the ruins. There is a sword in wet earth, a damaged memory, and the outline of a man history can still feel, but cannot fully name.